tell you.
Not like that! Not like that! No! Stop it!
Greetings. I'm going to tell the story of the English Civil War. At least, hopefully, I'll hit the biggest pieces of that story of the English Civil War. So when I tell stories, before I tell the actual story itself, usually I like to give a little bit of background information, because I think that really helps people understand the story, understanding that which led to the story itself. And that means going back and referring to another story, because in history there's always a story that precedes the current story. So I'm going to refer vaguely to a few other stories, to the history that occurred before the English Civil War, and maybe someday I'll make a more thorough video on the history that preceded the English Civil War and the topics I'm about to just vaguely touch on before we get to the meat and potatoes of today's lecture. So I'd like to begin this story of the English Civil War with Henry VIII, who lived about a good 100 years before the English Civil War ever took place. Henry VIII, as most of you probably recall, was that Tudor King of England who had a lot of wives. First he was married to Catherine of Aragon, then he was married to Anne Boleyn, then he was married to Jane Seymour, then he was married to Anne of Cleves, and then Catherine Howard, and then finally Catherine Parr. And there's a popular rhyme to describe the family values of Henry VIII. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. And because of these family values of Henry VIII, we end up with a situation in England where Henry VIII ends up transforming England from a Catholic kingdom, which they had been for many, many centuries, into a Protestant kingdom. Also, as a result of all of these estranged marriages of Henry VIII, he's got a lot of kids from different wives. Well, he's got three heirs that are out there. And each of them is in a very different political situation, and the politics are very intertwined with the religious beliefs, the institutional religious beliefs of the Kingdom of England. So after Henry VIII's death, his son Edward VII takes over for a short while, and he's a Protestant ruler who never really ruled because he was always very, very young when he was king. And then he dies, and his sister, Mary I, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, becomes queen. She's a Roman Catholic. She turns back the clock, brings back Roman Catholicism as the official religion in England, persecutes Protestants, and then dies. And then suddenly Queen Elizabeth I comes to power, and she brings back Protestantism and now is persecuting those Catholics who won't accept Protestantism. So that's a very shaky time, to be around. One moment you're supposed to be a Catholic, the next moment you're supposed to be a Protestant. I was reading John Locke's second treatise on government recently, and he had a line in that book that I thought was kind of clever. He basically commented that there couldn't have been any sincere believers in England at the time, because conveniently, at that precise moment when the new monarch would take over, everyone would suddenly convert, to whatever religion they were supposed to be. And to him, that was kind of a sign, if you're really a sincere believer, you don't just magically convert to whatever religion is the in religion, which of course everyone was doing for the sake of their own survival during these years. But it certainly led to a lot of turbulence, in the lives of people and also in the flow of government in England, all these changes. And then, to make things even worse, when Elizabeth died, she didn't have any children. She had no heirs. She was the Virgin Queen, from which we get Virginia, the state. Virginia. She had no heirs, no kids, and the crown passes to James I, a Stuart king, the first king in that new dynasty, the Stuarts. And his mother had been Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman who was a Roman Catholic, and a woman who had tried to assassinate Elizabeth at one time. Well, that aside, James I was never a Roman Catholic as far as I'm aware, and he didn't really know his mother. Obviously, they had to be in the same room together at least once, but beyond that, there's not a lot of interaction between the two. So it's not like James I becomes king and then wants to avenge his mother, who was beheaded by Protestants as a Catholic who tried to assassinate the Protestant Queen of England. There's no evidence of anything like that. But he's still politically sort of a different entity than Elizabeth was, coming from a different dynasty. And throughout his years as king, the political situation is going to develop, as does the religious one. The English government becomes bankrupt. Things aren't running very efficiently. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation is continuing to develop. The Church of England is not the only Protestant church. And the Protestants in Europe, on the continent, are sort of more, I guess you'd say, theoretical in their theology than the monarchy is in Britain. You have all sorts of Protestant thinkers like Zwingli and Calvin who are really beginning to come up with new doctrines and are beginning to break down that former Catholic dogma more and more and more every day. And the Church of England never really went so far. They never really became very Calvinist. But the people in England were very Calvinistic. They were also very Calvinistic in Scotland, where Presbyterianism was the in religion. So you have low-level vicars, and you have wealthy aristocrats and the individuals of Parliament, hence the parliamentarians, who are very, very Calvinistic, whereas the Anglican Church, the Church of England, despite being Protestant, still seems very, very Roman Catholic. And that's going to lead to a huge divide. So when James I dies in 1625 and passes England on to his son, Charles I, Charles I inherits a kingdom with a lot of problems. There's a lot of money problems, for example. And Charles I can't get Parliament to give him any money. And that's really crummy because in 1628, early on in Charles's career as a king, Parliament had passed the Petition of Right, which established that in order for the king to levy taxes, he needed the permission of Parliament. Essentially, only Parliament can levy taxes. So that really upset Charles, and in 1629 he did away with that session of Parliament. He sent them away and did not call Parliament again for 11 years, which further augmented that disparity between Parliament and the king. They're definitely even more distant. They're on different teams, more so because of these 11 years when Parliament can't even assemble. And in the meantime, to some degree, Charles I defies the Petition of Right, because Charles I wants a modern navy. Henry VIII is often credited as the king who first founded a modern navy, in the sense that they actually had a formal institutional navy in England. During the Middle Ages, they didn't have this. During the Middle Ages, when a king needed a navy because he was going to war, he commandeered ships from merchants. He didn't have his fleet of war vessels ready to go. Henry VIII constructed a few, not very many. Now Charles I wants a real navy, a big navy, because this is the age of colonization of the Americas. It's an age where naval warfare, I think, is becoming more and more relevant, especially for an island nation such as Britain. So he's going to begin to collect ship money, or so they called it, which is basically a tax to build this navy that Charles wanted. And that also led to a lot of contention between Charles I and the rabble of England, the average Calvinist, as well as the figures of Parliament that don't get to meet, the parliamentarians, as I'm going to refer to them throughout this lecture. And of course there's additional religious conflicts, because the Calvinistic views are becoming more and more radical, more and more developed every day. Meanwhile, the Church of England remains just as Catholic as it's always been. In fact, in the eyes of a lot of these parliamentarians, the Anglican Church is becoming more and more Catholic every day. And that was largely because of Charles I's wife. Charles I was married to the daughter of the King of France. Her name was Henrietta Maria. And Henrietta Maria had lots and lots of Catholic priests that were always with her 24/7. She would hear Mass multiple times every day. And she would bring her priests with her to social events and was often accused of trying to turn back the clock in England by converting leading officials, powerful officials, aristocrats, and so forth back to Roman Catholicism. So she's very much so hated by the average Protestant in England because of her Catholicism. But not just because of her Catholicism. Her priests weren't just your average archdiocesan Catholic priests. They were Jesuits, which made everything a million times worse. Because the Jesuit order was founded in the late 15th century by Ignatius Loyola, right before the Protestant Reformation was kicking off. Okay? Right before the Protestant Reformation was kicking off. So, as a new order, as this is becoming the theological and political climate of Europe, they found great opportunity in becoming agents of counter-reformation. An order of priests that was devoted to the endeavor of turning back the clock politically and theologically in trying to get Protestants and Protestant kingdoms throughout Europe to come back to Roman Catholicism. So we're going to see throughout the reign of Elizabeth I, Jesuits continually trying to assassinate her. And some of these plots by Jesuits to assassinate Elizabeth are seen by historians as being more credible than others. But it's important to note that the conspiracy by the ancestor of Charles I, Mary Queen of Scots, involved Jesuits. And then, of course, in 1605, on November 5th of 1605, we have the infamous gunpowder plot, which most of you have probably heard of, and some of you may have even celebrated as Guy Fawkes Day, which is a day where Jesuits and Guy Fawkes supposedly attempted to blow up the House of Lords with a gunpowder keg that was stored in the basement underneath. And of course, this gunpowder plot was discovered, Guy Fawkes was arrested, it was thwarted, and that's why we celebrate Guy Fawkes Day on the 5th of November every year. So, the Jesuits have a reputation not only as being these hated papists, these, Catholics that are really despised by Calvinist Protestants in England, but of being the equivalent to what we would probably see Al-Qaeda operatives as today. They're the ones that are always trying to assassinate our rulers, our Protestant rulers, our Protestant leaders. They were really people, I think, that were hated within the English-speaking world at this time. And all of that hatred certainly trickled towards Henrietta Maria when she flaunted her Jesuit priests, and then at her husband as well. Henrietta Maria eventually earned the nickname in England, the Whore of Babylon. And they referred to her as the Whore of Babylon because in the speaking and writing of lots and lots of influential Protestant figures throughout the 16th and 17th century in Europe, you see lots of references to the Babylonian captivity, because Martin Luther had written a treatise called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church in 1520. And this is one of the three most influential treatises that Martin Luther constructed throughout his career. And this treatise very clearly construed an analogy where the biblical captivity of the tribe of Judah in Babylon is compared to the theoretical captivity of the true Christian church, the Protestant Christian church, by the Catholic Church throughout the Middle Ages leading up to the Protestant Reformation itself. And this analogy leads to, terms and phrases like, Babylonian horror, horror of Babylon, being a term associated with a Catholic ruler, especially one that rules in a Protestant kingdom such as Henrietta Maria. But it gets a little bit worse for Charles I, because he sort of imprudently appointed an individual by the name of William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the leading clergyman in the Church of England, and William Laud is a figure with a reputation of being a papist, someone who has very Roman Catholic tendencies. He was also seen as being very flamboyant. He was also seen as an Arminian. And Arminianism is a branch of Protestantism derived from a Dutch theoretician by the name of Jacobus Arminius. And I'll be fully honest, I don't know very much about Jacobus Arminius, but his theology was very distinct from the theology of the more traditional Calvinists that you would have found in England at the time. And there was a lot of, accusations that William Laud had Arminian tendencies, and other figures within the Church of England and other agents of Charles I. So these are a lot of the accusations that are being thrown at William Laud, the leading clergyman within the government of Charles I, the leading, clergyman within his church, and someone who definitely has his ear, one of his leading advisors. Then things get even worse for Charles I, because he made another bad decision. Charles I decided to impose the current Act of Uniformity. There are multiple Acts of Uniformity throughout English history. Basically, they amount to a standardization of the prayers and beliefs of the Church of England. He decides to impose that on the Scottish Kirk, or the Church in Scotland, which is distinctively Presbyterian. And this means that the Scottish Kirk is supposed to embrace the current Act of Uniformity, as well as the current Book of Common Prayer in England, which even the Protestants of England saw as being too Catholic for them. So this really, really, really irritates the Presbyterians in Scotland. So their response to this is to assemble at the Glasgow Assembly. And this was an event where all of the nobles of Scotland, these Presbyterian nobles, came together and they formed the Covenant. The Covenant was an event, or really an organization, I guess you'd say, where all these Covenanters, these Presbyterian nobles, were going to form an army, and they were going to lead a war effort against Charles I to defend the Scottish Kirk, to defend the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, because they don't want this popery imposed upon them the way that Protestants in England had had popery imposed upon them in their mindset. Well, this is really bad for Charles I, because now he has to fight a war on the same island, that England sits. So he can't use his navy. This isn't a war that's going on in the continent that England's been drawn into. It's very much so in their face. And they need to find a way to deal with it. He needs to find a way to fight this war. And you cannot finance a war without money. Charles I inherited a broke government, and he lacks the ability to levy taxes because of the Petition of Right that was issued by Parliament in 1628. So, for the first time in 11 years, Charles I calls Parliament. And this is called the Short Parliament because they meet from the 13th of April in 1640 until the 5th of May in 1640. Not very long, about a month. And absolutely nothing is accomplished by the Short Parliament because Charles I doesn't like anything that they have to say, And they haven't met in 11 years, so most of these figures have never actually met for, parliamentary procedure. So supposedly it was very awkward when they first showed up because no one knew who was supposed to speak. They weren't quite accustomed to parliamentary procedure. So nothing's accomplished, and then the short parliament is ended. And there's a bit of a gap throughout the summer of 1640 where nothing is being accomplished for Charles, and he is losing these wars against the Scottish Kirk that they begin to call the Bishops' Wars. So on the 3rd of November in 1640, Charles I decides he's going to try Parliament again. He calls Parliament once more, and the very first thing that this Parliament does is establish an Act of Parliament that basically establishes that the only entity that can dissolve Parliament is the House of Commons, is Parliament itself. Now Charles is really in a pickle because he has a Parliament that is assembled. He doesn't like them, but he needs them, and he can't get rid of them, and they don't like him. And he's stuck really in this situation. He doesn't even have the option to tell Parliament to go away anymore. And the leading figure in this Parliament is a gentleman by the name of John Pym. John Pym is really a hothead. He is not the kind of guy that's ever going to compromise. He is very uncompromising, and he is going to get what he wants. And he isn't going to give Charles I an inch. And that's really unfortunate because the whole idea of calling this Parliament was to reach a compromise and get tax money to finance this war. This period in English history, this period that's going to develop into the English Civil War, is really the first instance in English history where we have large-scale propaganda. Because the printing press has been around for a while at this point. And you see it both from the pamphleteers that were working for Charles I and from the pamphleteers that were working for Parliament. And there were a lot of hotheads that were parliamentarians that had been arrested in the years leading up to 1640 for criticizing William Laud. Two individuals that were arrested for criticizing William Laud include William Prynne and Henry Burton. Both of these individuals were cropped, meaning that their ears were cut off, and I believe they were branded on the head. I know William Prynne was branded on the head. And then they were thrown in prison with life sentences. And other individuals were cropped and hanged for similar crimes of criticizing the Church of England, Charles I, William Laud, etc. One of the first things that John Pym does after establishing that Act of Parliament that said that the king, can't tell him to go away anymore, was to garner the release of William Prynne and Henry Burton. And these individuals emerge from British jails without their ears, but with a new status, that of Protestant martyrs, martyred by that ear-eater, William Laud. Actually, the pamphleteers of Parliament were describing William Laud as a satanic beast that was feeding off of the ears of Protestant martyrs. And that sort of theme within the propaganda of the parliamentarians really fed the flames. Another event that the propagandists of Parliament really latched onto at the time was this event that we refer to as the Queen's Rebellion. In October of 1641, there was a revolt of Irish Catholics against English Protestants in Ireland. And the propagandists of the parliamentarian side really blew this situation out of proportion. They described this event as a revolt by Irish Catholics inspired by that whore of Babylon, Queen Henrietta Maria, and these individuals inspired by the Catholic Queen massacred English Protestants. Nothing worse could possibly have been done by the English monarchy, and lots of people believed this. This is a time where people thought that if it appeared in print, it had to be true. which reminds me very much of what a lot of people thought of the internet when it first kind of popped up in the 1990s for the public to use. If it appears, then it must be true, which everyone knows is nonsense. But the gullible people, you know, they believed everything they read, and that made the flames of propaganda much, much hotter. So all of this culminates against the Catholic, well, they're not really Catholic, they're seen as Catholic, the monarchy. Well, Henrietta and Maria's Catholic, but the rest of them technically aren't Catholic. But there's a lot of hatred now against the monarchy and against William Laud. So Parliament has William Laud arrested and tried for treason. And the king's next closest advisor after Laud, Viscount Thomas Wentworth, encouraged the king to sort of go with this, to sort of go with the flow, sacrifice Laud, and then perhaps Pym and the other figures within the Long Parliament would be more willing to work with you, give you your money, help you fight your war, everything will work out. So Laud is convicted of treason by the Long Parliament and hanged. By the way, we're calling it the Long Parliament because it's not going away anytime soon, because they established that Act of Parliament early on that established that they could not be dissolved by anyone but themselves, and they don't want to go away anytime soon. And now they've hanged William Laud for treason because Viscount Thomas Wentworth recommended that Charles I go with this. Ironically, the next victim of the Long Parliament was Thomas Wentworth himself, the next closest advisor to the king, who the Long Parliament had arrested, brought up on treason charges, and then he went through the trial, and they weren't able to garner a conviction for treason with due process, because really Thomas Wentworth had irritated the Long Parliament, but he'd done nothing that came close to treason. So even with a very biased court, the Long Parliament could not get a conviction on Thomas Wentworth. But they were able to force the king's hand, and they were able to execute Thomas Wentworth upon a bill of attainder, which really goes to show you just how powerful this Long Parliament was at this point. And Charles I is really in a bad situation because he keeps making concessions, and time keeps going on and on and on. And the whole reason he brought this Long Parliament into existence was so that he could resolve his qualms with the Parliament and get money to fight this war, and he is only seeing a situation develop where things are getting worse and worse between himself and Parliament, and he still doesn't have his money, and he's still losing these bishops' wars. So a lot of bad stuff is going on for Charles I. Bad, bad stuff. Eventually, the Long Parliament brought forward the Grand Remonstrance near the end of 1641 and the beginning of 1642. And this was a formal list of grievances against King Charles, and sort of a list of demands that Parliament had of him. Very long list, very, very grave demands, very grave instances of Charles having wronged them in their mindset. So this is definitely a bad thing. And then shortly after Pym issues the Grand Remonstrance, rumors begin to circulate that John Pym and other individuals within the Long Parliament are planning on doing to Queen Henrietta Maria what they had already done to William Laud and what they had done to Thomas Wentworth. They were going to accuse the Queen of treason in the hopes of having the Queen executed. Well, at this point, John Pym has overplayed his hand. He's gone way too far. You cannot accuse the Queen of treason and try to have the king's wife, the mother of the heirs to the throne, executed. That's just way too much. So, Henrietta Maria supposedly yelled at her husband that he needed to grow a spine and he needed to deal with John Pym. And inspired by this horror of Babylon's yelling, she sent Charles I to Parliament. And Charles I believed that he had grown this spine that his wife demanded he grow. And he believed that he was going to stomp out the situation once and for all by delivering an arrest warrant for John Pym, as well as John Hampton, Denzil Hollis, Arthur Hazelrig, and William Strode, the 5 leading figures within the Long Parliament. He was going to deliver an arrest warrant for them for treason, for conspiring to have the Queen executed. So on the 4th of January 1642, he rides into the House of Commons, and he believes that no one knows this is coming, and he's going to give a brilliant speech in the front of the House of Commons, and he's going to condemn John Pym and his cronies of their wrongdoings in front of everyone. He's going to embarrass them, he's going to have them arrested, he's going to have them tried and hanged, and he thinks that he's going to retake control of the situation. The problem was when Charles got to the House of Commons and he entered the chambers and went to the front, he noticed that those 5 individuals were missing. And suddenly everyone in the House of Commons began to laugh, which made this situation very, very embarrassing for Charles, because his plan to grow a spine and stomp on these parliamentarians had backfired, because they knew it was coming and they had hidden John Pym and his fellow conspirators within the Long Parliament. So, deeply embarrassed, Charles I leaves the chambers of the House of Commons, and the arrest warrants for these individuals remain issued. They're still hunting them down, even though they're in hiding. So now, going into the spring and summer of 1642, we have a situation where the leading figures of Parliament have moved towards a death warrant for the Queen of England, and the King of England has issued warrants for the arrest with the presumption of, leading to execution for treason of the leading figures within Parliament. So they've almost formally declared war on one another, and everyone can see that the situation really has exploded to that extent. And throughout the spring and summer of 1642, both camps are preparing for war. People are deciding what side they are going to side with. Armies are beginning to be constructed on both sides. So we see throughout the summer of 1642, everyone is starting to get ready for war. But of course, everyone was really very ill-prepared for war. No one really has much of a standing army ready to go. So the development of the English Civil War, even after both sides had decided that they were going to war, took a while to kick off. But eventually, on the 23rd of October, 1642, we see the Battle of Edge Hill, which is really the first battle of the English Civil War. This was an event where the Earl of Essex, whose name was Robert Devereux, his father was also the Earl of Essex named Robert Devereux, clashed with Sir Jacob Astley, the Royalist general, at the Battle of Edge Hill. And at this point, the Earl of Essex is the biggest general within the parliamentarian army, the parliamentarian forces that had been built up until this point. His father had been an agent of Queen Elizabeth's, but then had been involved in a plot to overthrow her and was thus executed for treason in 1601. But now his son, the Earl of Essex, is leading Parliament's forces, but the Earl of Essex was defeated at the Battle of Edge Hill. It didn't go very well for Parliament. His Roundheads were defeated. By the way, they usually refer to parliamentarian forces during the English Civil War as Roundheads because they wear these helmets that were very round is, I believe, the reason why they call them Roundheads. And then very often they refer to soldiers within the Royalist military as Cavaliers. Cavaliers is usually the nickname that's used for those military personnel. So throughout the winter of 1642, going into the spring of 1643, we see in the wake of the Battle of Edge Hill, both parliamentary and royalist forces are really not quite ready to fight a full-blown war. There's some military activity, but it's very small scale. We see smaller raids, smaller battles, smaller besiegements, but we don't see anything like the Battle of Edge Hill, which really was a full-fledged, big battle, and the first real battle of the English Civil War. But throughout this period of building up for war, this build-up period during the winter and spring of 1642 to 1643, we see the individuals who are going to be the biggest generals throughout the English Civil War becoming big names. We see them building their armies. We see them making political deals that are going to give them the highest commissions in these armies. The first individual of note that I'd like to refer to is William Waller. William Waller was one of the biggest generals on the parliamentarian side. He had served as a Venetian officer earlier in life. They often refer to this generation of Englishmen, the Englishmen who fought in the English Civil War, as a generation that had never fought a war, because there really hadn't been any wars to fight in their lifetime as Englishmen. So the only Englishmen who had any experience in fighting wars up until this point were those that had gone and fought in the continent. And William Waller had some experiences in the Venetian army, and he had participated in Bohemia in the 30 Years' War, which had raged around this time. So he's a very experienced and noteworthy general for Parliament. But his equivalent in the Royalist side was Prince Rupert, Count Palatine of the Rhine. And Prince Rupert had also fought in the 30 Years' War. He was the son of Frederick V, who was the Elector of the Rhine. He was from Bohemia. And his mother was Elizabeth, the sister of Charles I, the daughter of James I. So that made Prince Rupert the nephew of Charles I. And during the 30 Years' War, Rupert had been a very, very successful and distinguished cavalry commander. He was seen as a very talented man. So by the time the English Civil War has broken out, his uncle Charles has greeted him with open arms and wants him to command his forces, because he actually has a lot of experience in waging war, whereas most generals in England didn't really have quite the credentials that Rupert had. So Charles I, the uncle of Prince Rupert, made Prince Rupert the Duke of Cumberland and the Earl of Holderness, and had given him all kinds of titles and rank within England and within his army. So he is definitely a very big figure. Another big figure on the Royalist side to comment upon is George Digby. George Digby was a favorite of the king's, and he would serve as a military officer throughout the war as well. But before he was really doing anything very military-like, or at least something that we traditionally think of as being very military-like, he had been Charles I's primary propaganda officer. He organized something called the Mercurius Aulicus, which bore the subtitle of Communicating the Intelligence and Affairs of the Court to the Rest of the Kingdom. This was a professional, or at least official, propaganda organ that was going to publish pamphlets that sort of belittled the competency of Parliament and their military forces. And remember, this is an age of propaganda, because the printing press has been around for an awful long time, and the people are very gullible. If it appears in print, especially with the seal of the king on it, it looks pretty official. They're going to believe it. So he would apparently send people out, these dispatchers throughout the country, and they'd be dressed as homeless people, and then underneath their clothes they'd have just like stacks of pamphlets that they had published in Oxford, and then they'd pass those pamphlets out to the local population to stir up anti-parliamentarian sentiments among them and to promote the Royalist cause. Of course, Parliament was doing the same thing, and they had their own professional organs for promoting their own pamphlets of propaganda. But one other figure I really wanted to talk about before we move on with the English Civil War is an individual by the name of Ralph Hopton. Ralph Hopton was from Bath, and he was another favorite of the king. I'm sorry, I can't talk today. Another favorite of the kings. And Ralph Hopton was actually knighted the day that Charles I became king, at the same coronation ceremony for the king, and he was made a baron by Charles I. So, even though he's a member of Parliament, the member of Parliament from Bath, Ralph Hopton decides to back the Royalists, and he spends this winter of 1642 and 1643, building an army at Cornwall to defend the king, to, serve the Royalist cause. And by May of 1643, Hopton's Cornish army is successfully capturing Brood and Stratton. And supposedly, Hopton's forces ran out of gunpowder and supplies pretty quickly, but they just kept fighting with pikes and little swords, and they were very successful, and they were able to round up somewhere in the ballpark of 1,700 prisoners of war throughout May of 1643. So when this was all said and done, Hopton is feeling very successful, and he writes a letter to William Waller requesting a prisoner exchange. And William Waller very politely declined this request. William Waller was at the time besieging Royalist forces at Worcester. So now that Hopton had been very successful throughout May of 1643, he's going to go and try to relieve Worcester of Waller's besiegement. So Hopton is going to rendezvous with Prince Maurice, who's the younger brother of Prince Rupert, and another individual who's the Marquis of Hertford. And they rendezvous together, and then they combine their armies, and then they're able to engage Waller at Worcester, and they're able to drive him back and lift the besiegement of Worcester. This is obviously a good thing for the Royalists, but it's not exactly a clear Royalist victory. It's not a clear Royalist victory by any means. In fact, Hopton was severely wounded at the battle. Both armies were very, very beaten up after the besiegement at Worcester and the corresponding battle for Worcester. And they both needed to take a step back and catch their breaths, or so to speak. So Hopton, who's wounded, retreats to a small town called Devizes down in Wiltshire. Meanwhile, Waller retreats in the same direction, and he sets up camp at Romway Down, which is really just a field north of the town of Devizes. So you have the two armies that are basically camped right next to each other and are waiting to attack each other again. So it becomes a matter of who can get reinforcements to their army quickest, because whichever army is reinforced quicker is going to get the jump on the other one. Meanwhile, Prince Maurice and the Marquis of Hertford both moved away, so it's just Hopton and Waller now. And it turns out that when these camps are sitting and waiting for reinforcements, that at this point Parliament was actually more efficient at supplying their armies than the Royalists. And Waller was able to get support from Parliament before Hopton was able to get any support from Oxford, from the king. So, Waller gets reinforcements, Hopton still has no reinforcements. Waller is able to mount a new offensive, and he besieges the town of Devizes, which actually did have a nice, set of ramparts, some nice fortifications. But it's under besiegement, and Hopton isn't getting any reinforcements, so this is a crummy deal for Hopton, and Waller thinks that he might just be able to bounce back from this. So, Hopton sends envoys, and he doesn't know if any of his envoys, his couriers, are getting through. And it would seem that his first few waves of couriers probably did not get through Waller's lines, because Oxford did not receive any envoys from Hopton until the 11th of July in 1643, which is at about a month of besiegement of Devizes. So this really is just about the last moment. If this courier did not reach Oxford on the 11th of July, 1643, Devizes probably would have fallen and Hopton would have just been slaughtered. But he's able to finally get a courier through. And when the courier finally gets to Oxford from Devizes, the courier, explains to Oxford what's going on, and they inform him that they had already sent Lord Wilmot as a reinforcing agent to Hopton, but they had no idea how severe the situation was. So they immediately send Sir John Byron and Prince Maurice to rendezvous with Lord Wilmot at Marlborough so that they have a force that's big enough to actually take on William Waller. And they're able to do this very quickly once they realize they need to do this. They were very efficient with their time management, obviously, because they got the job done very quickly. And 2 days later, on the 13th of July, 1643, Sir John Byron, Prince Maurice, and Lord Wilmot arrive in Roundway Down to end the besiegement of Devizes, and this was what they call the Battle of Roundway Down. And it was an event where William Waller was slaughtered pretty badly. His forces were slaughtered just mercilessly. And there was supposedly a ditch. It was like, I guess, a natural kind of inclination into the earth at Roundway Down. And lots of dead cavalrymen, dead Roundhead cavalrymen, ended up in this ditch. So they supposedly called it the Bloody Ditch after this battle at Roundway Down. This is really the low point in the English Civil War for Parliament. Waller returned to London after this horrible defeat for the parliamentarian side, and he is blamed by Parliament as this guy that let them down and allowed this horrible defeat to occur. Meanwhile, Waller turns around and he blames the Earl of Essex. He says that Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was in a position where he could have relieved him, but he chose not to. And he was also in a position where he had to know that this relieving force, led by Wilmot and Byron and Prince Maurice, was heading towards Waller, and he did absolutely nothing about it. So he shifts the blame from himself to Essex. Well, meanwhile, Essex blames Parliament, saying that his army really was immobilized at the time because Parliament wasn't supplying them. And without food or payment, his troops were starving, they were deserting, they weren't listening to their officers, and there was no way that he could command this force until Parliament got its act together and started supplying his forces. So now there's this big clash between Parliament and Essex, and as everyone's playing the blame game, they finally get word that at the end of June, Thomas Fairfax, who's probably a little-known name at the time, that's going to change very quickly, had been defeated at Adwalton Moor at the end of June and had been pushed back by Royalist forces and had suffered a few other defeats. I believe one of them was at Leeds. And basically the world's just collapsing on Parliament. Everything seems bad. Everyone's blaming each other. They're losing all their battles. Everything's bad. Nothing is good. They have no good news. And meanwhile, the people of London are starting to riot. Some are starting to riot because the war is being lost. Lots of people are angry at Parliament. Lots of people are angry because of different things within their individual political, beliefs, because half of them believe everything that they read, and most of that was probably craziness. So they believe all kinds of crazy things, and they're all rioting, and everyone's outraged. Some have all kinds of religious arguments. Some disagree with the religious beliefs that Parliament is now promoting. Others are angry at papists, still, so that's incorporated into the shouts of the mob. And you have lots of riots over all these sorts of things. But even worse, now you have mass hunger and disease and lawlessness and, of course, a war-torn country. And that's certainly fueling the flames of discontent. Something that we see throughout the English Civil War, something that we see probably for decades after the English Civil War, is that the very fabric of society in England began to fall apart. They weren't very organized. They didn't have militaries ready to go when the war started. It was a very makeshift process, building these militaries and then trying to supply them and organize them. So the behavior of military personnel and the way that these guys were able to eat basically amounted to stealing from civilians and harassing civilians. Everywhere an army marched, they left a trail of hunger and death and disease. Because they go into a town, they'd quarter themselves, they'd steal all the food, they'd tear everything up, and then the town is now hungry. And when you have lots of hungry people, and when you have lots of people that are displaced, because you have people that would normally not be leaving their villages ever, now they're moving all around the country, lots of people moving, lots of hunger, it's going to lead to lots of disease. So there's lots of hunger, lots of disease, lots of lawlessness, and of course lots of war and political tension and propaganda everywhere. So it seems like everything is falling apart. Things are becoming really, really, really bad really, really quickly. So now we have a situation where Parliament is clearly losing the war and the Royalists are advancing on London. This is a really bad situation for Parliament. But suddenly things are going to change. Because at the very, very end of the summer of 1643, the first Battle of Newbury is going to occur. This is on the 20th of September, and Prince Rupert and Sir John Byron and Prince Maurice and King Charles himself, as they're advancing towards London, end up becoming engaged by the Earl of Essex and leading parliamentary forces. And this is seen as the first turning point of the war, because against all odds, the Royalists are defeated. And this halted the Royalist advance on London. And when the Royalist advance on London is halted, the Royalists have to begin to sort of retreat. It isn't quite a full-blown retreat, but they have to give up some territory, and they're no longer advancing. So the Royalists give up Gloucester, and they give up Reading, and they continue to pull back, and the war seems to lull out near the end of 1643. At the beginning of 1644, Charles I establishes a separate parliament in Christ Church College at Oxford. But he recognizes that things are not going very well for his war effort. Newbury changed everything for the Royalist side. His pregnant wife is now planning on leaving to France for her own safety, and she would successfully reach the shores of France by April, but she was certainly planning on leaving by January or February of 1644. Also, at the very beginning of 1644, Parliament was able to cement a formal military alliance with Scotland. Okay? They were able to cement a formal military alliance. So now King Charles I is losing the war, and he's got two countries essentially at war with him, Scotland and the parliamentarian side of the Civil War. So, this is still January of 1644, and we have an event called the Battle at Nantwich. And at Nantwich is kind of in the north. It's pretty far away from London, by the way. At Nantwich, Sir John Byron is besieging the city. It's in parliamentary hands. But then Thomas Fairfax and his cousin, his lesser-known cousin, William Fairfax, show up to relieve Nantwich, and they lift the besiegement. So now Byron is retreating, and Fairfax is pursuing him, pushing him towards Oxford, the Royalist capital, more and more every day. Meanwhile, William Waller is chasing Prince Rupert through the Midlands and through Hampshire. And this goes on throughout the late winter and spring of 1644. But by the time we get to the summer of 1644, Royalist forces cannot keep retreating. And a huge battle occurs at Marston Moor on the 2nd of July of 1644. And at this battle, Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell emerge as heroes for the parliamentarian side. And they just utterly decimate the Royalist forces under Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert is said to have referred to Cromwell after this battle as Ironsides. And that was a nickname that Cromwell was happy to receive, and it became a name that he shared with his fellow Roundhead cavalrymen. But this was really a huge defeat for the Royalists, who lost, I think, about 4,150 casualties approximately at Marston Moor, whereas the parliamentarians only lost about 300 soldiers at Marston Moor. Huge disparity in the quantities of casualties that the two sides are facing, and of course the Royalists were already on the losing side at this point. Things are getting worse for them, and they're still getting worse and worse and worse and worse every day. Alright? Things are getting very, very bad for them. Then, Cromwell and Fairfax go back to London. And you probably remember that after the Battle of Ramway Down, when Essex and Waller went back to London and stood before the Parliament after a great defeat, they were ridiculed as villains and criticized by Parliament, and they blamed each other, and everyone ended up blaming each other, and there were riots, and everything was bad. Now you have the opposite effect. After this huge victory at Marston Moor, Fairfax and Cromwell are celebrated as heroes, they're saluted by Parliament, and the crowd is loving the situation that they find themselves in at this point. And, you know, this is just a completely, reversed world than it had been the summer before, only a year before. But now everything's different. It's very ironic because throughout that entire year from 1643 to 1644, the Earl of Essex was petitioning Parliament for more supplies. He was saying, you know, you have to give me more resources if you want me to continue to wage this war, if you want me to have a chance at defeating the Royalists. And they never gave it to him because he didn't play his politics well, and Parliament had already scapegoated Essex for a lot of their early defeats. But Cromwell, being Parliament's sweetheart after Marston Moor, is able to walk right into Parliament and request a new army, a new, formal army, lots of new resources allocated to him, and he's able to get it. And this becomes what they call the New Model Army, which is under the command of Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. So now this New Model Army has emerged, and the parliamentarians had recently decimated the Royalists at Marston Moor, and the Royalists are retreating. Charles barely made it back to Oxford, and Rupert and most of the Royalist army hasn't quite made it there yet. The Royalists have two choices, the retreating Royalists. They can either retreat directly to Oxford and try and hold out there and defend the Royalist capital, or they can advance into the Midlands and try to steer the New Model Army away from Oxford. And the main Royalist army, under the command of Prince Rupert, decides to go for the latter of those options. They shift their advance into the Midlands and are pursued by the New Model Army. And this leads to the Battle of Naseby, which really finished off what was left of Prince Rupert's army. This was in June of 1645, and the Royalists, well, they were just destroyed. I mean, they were not in fighting condition after this battle. This really is the last battle, the last big battle of the English Civil War in England. And over 5,000 Royalists ended up surrendering at the end of it. And it's really unfortunate for these guys because they were apparently treated horribly, they weren't being fed, and after a while, Roundheads, parliamentarian troops, just started killing them in mass numbers in pretty horrible ways. And all these rumors began to surface about the horrible conditions of the POW camps following Naseby. So all these family members of Royalist soldiers were then flocking to the camps with whatever valuables they had, whether it be their life savings or some jewelry that the family regarded as valuable, and they were just giving their life savings away to these parliamentarian troops, pleading with them not to kill their loved ones, or pleading with them to give them some food because so many were dying of starvation in captivity. And then for those that survived the POW camps themselves, they all ended up being paraded around London where the mob was throwing rocks and rotten vegetables and things like that at them as they continued to celebrate these great victories, which were great victories and probably worth celebrating from Parliament's perspective. So Rupert really doesn't have much of an army, but what he does have left is still retreating, and Fairfax keeps sending messages to Rupert that he wants him to come to the peace table and negotiate terms of surrender because he's basically beat. But then Fairfax realizes after a while that Rupert has no intentions of coming to negotiate with him, but he's taking advantage of all of the ceasefires and other things that Fairfax keeps calling for so that Rupert would have the opportunity to do so. So eventually Fairfax and the new model lose patience with Prince Rupert, and they directly engage him at Prior's Hill Fort on the 10th of September in 1646. No, it was September, sorry, the 10th of September, 1645. Yeah, that was the year. I'm sorry about that. But at that event, Rupert is directly engaged by the New Model Army, by Fairfax, and he's defeated, and he surrenders to Fairfax. He's captured, and what's left of his army is captured. Fairfax was very, very kind to Rupert. He let him go free. He let him march back to Oxford fully armed with his colours in hand, just with the promise that he would cease to wage this war. And it was a gentleman's agreement, and gentlemen usually honored their agreements back then, and as far as I'm aware, Prince Rupert completely honored, his side of that deal. But it was a really good deal from Rupert's perspective, and he marched back to Oxford with his army, and apparently Charles I was really upset to hear about this and blamed Rupert and accused him of plotting a coup to overthrow him and all kinds of nonsense that, of course, is based on rubbish. So Charles I knows he's going to lose this war because he has no troops left. He entertains some notions that maybe he could build an army out of Irish Catholics and then get them to cross the Irish Sea and help him out in England, but of course that really was not feasible, just considering the amount of time that it would have taken to build that army and to ship the army across, and of course how is he going to supply this army? It just isn't at all feasible. All of his top generals have been defeated. The war is really over. So Charles decides that he's going to surrender to the Scots, because the Stuart monarchs had been the monarchs of Scotland for a lot longer than they had been the monarchs of England, and he thought that maybe the Scots were a little bit less irritated with him than the parliamentarians were. After all, the parliamentarians have a really bad track record of executing all of his top officials. They wanted to execute his wife, and they're run by radicals like John Pym. So why not take your chances with Scotland? So he left Oxford on the 27th of April in 1646, and he moves towards Scotland. He eventually reaches a Scottish army on the 6th of May, 1646, and surrenders himself. But then, a month later in June, the Scots sell King Charles I to Parliament, which is really bad for Charles I. So Parliament has now captured King Charles I. You would think that they'd be pretty happy, right? Well, not really. Right after they capture Charles I, they immediately begin to see lots and lots of power struggles between various figures within the Long Parliament and within the military, and of course, military and Parliament clashing with one another. Eventually, Parliament begins to try to disband the military. They formally try to disband the New Model Army on the 27th of May, 1647. Of course, very few soldiers are actually willing to disband, officers and enlisted men alike. Who, after fighting this war, is going to step down after having never been compensated for their service? No one. Well, not very many. Very, very few soldiers are willing to disband without payment, which is what Parliament was essentially asking them to do. Of course, Parliament doesn't want to pay them, and they're also worried that the military is going to seize power, so there's a lot of reasons why they're trying to disband all of these troops. And of course, from the standpoint of military, yeah, they want to get paid, but there's also a lot of concern that if they stay in the military under the direction of Parliament, they're going to be sent to Ireland, because in Ireland there's supposedly armies of loyal royalist Roman Catholics, and that's a threat to Parliament. So there's all this concern that you're going to be sent to Ireland to fight the royalists that are still at large in Ireland, and no one wanted to die fighting in Ireland after having survived this war, especially since they are not very confident that they're ever going to be paid if they do survive Ireland. So we see lots and lots of armies disband or desert because of the organized efforts to disband these armies as well as their grievances, but these armies that do actually disband or desert do not actually just go home. Most of them become marauding forces. So now you have marauding armies just trampling upon the civilian population in England, stealing their stuff and being very brutal with the civilian population, which is another layer of misery for the English population. Things are pretty bad for the people. I think I've already mentioned the war has caused hunger, caused disease, caused lawlessness for the people of England. Things are really bad for them, and now on top of it they have marauding forces and additional political turbulence that is, creating a lot of problems. And of course you have a lot of political activism, especially in London, from the people. The crowd is very active. They're pretty wild up. There's lots of riots, and this is because of all the political turbulence and the bad conditions throughout England, which, it was legitimately turbulent and conditions were legitimately bad. These people had lots of reason to riot and to have very strong views at the time. But of course you also have a propaganda machine that's still churning out very heated pamphlets that are sometimes misleading the population, but are either way, whether they were accurate or not, the propagandists, these pamphleteers, are inciting the anger of the people of England. And that's leading to a lot of anger as well. Also, lots of people aren't very happy with this new puritanical way of life that they have won for themselves in the English Civil War. You always hear that Oliver Cromwell banned Christmas. Well, that's not completely true. The Long Parliament banned Christmas. In fact, they prohibited by law all holidays except for days of fasting, and you were only allowed to fast on those days. Public festivities were banned. Colorful dress was banned. Most art was banned. Alcohol was definitely told back, the consumption, especially public consumption, at anything comparable to a festivity. So this is a very repressive social atmosphere under puritanic law, and lots of people aren't very happy with that, and a lot of them also aren't very happy with the theology that has won out as the new theology. Some groups are more radical than the Long Parliament, others are not quite pleased with the Long Parliament because they think that their version of Calvinist Protestantism is too radical or simply just theologically incorrect with, their own personal beliefs. And then you had groups such as the Levelers, for example. The Levelers are definitely a Christian group that was very different than the traditional Calvinists and Presbyterians that you would have found in England at the time. But what I think is more interesting about the Levelers than their theology would be their politics and their social views. They're seen in a lot of ways as being predecessors to the Jacobins of the Revolution in France at the end of the 18th century, or the Revolution in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century when the Bolsheviks seized power. I don't know if I go so far as to say that they were at all quite that radical. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But either way, they definitely wanted a pretty revolutionary reordering of society for the early 17th century within a puritanical society. But they were definitely very different, and they were very much so rejected by both the Long Parliament and the grandees of the army. The term grandee is a term that refers to the leading figures within the army, most notably the New Model Army, but the military establishment in general, those people that saw Oliver Cromwell as their leading figure. Then, as all of these bad things are occurring, Charles I escapes near the end of 1647, and he's at large until near the end of 1648. And when he's at large, it really stirs everything up, and lots of royalist armies begin to remobilize. Of course, there wasn't really much of a chance that he was actually going to bounce back and take his country back, but it certainly stirred everyone up. And one army that I think is worth noting would be the forces of Sir Charles Lucas. Sir Charles Lucas held out at Colchester, which was besieged for many, many months, and eventually, after the people were starving and sick and everything was really bad for them, Sir Charles Lucas, for the good of the civilian population of Colchester, was willing to surrender on the 28th of August in 1648, and I believe he and all of his officers were executed by a firing squad after they were eventually willing to capitulate and surrender for the good of the civilian population. But shortly after Colchester falls, the king was captured, and lots of royalist strongholds, both royalist communities that had supported the king during the initial English Civil War, or communities that expressed desire to continue to support him during the Second English Civil War, were sacked under orders of the Long Parliament. One community of note would be Devizes, that town just south of Romway Down, which was seen as being somewhat responsible for that humiliating defeat of the parliamentarian forces at the Battle of Romway Down during the beginning of the English Civil War. So lots of communities are sacked, the king is back in parliamentarian hands, and this problem would seem to have been averted from Parliament. But the Long Parliament's days are really at an end, because on the 6th of December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride, who is a grandee, storms Parliament and purged it of all of the enemies of Oliver Cromwell and of the army. So now, after the 6th of December 1648, we call this Parliament no longer the Long Parliament, but rather the Rump Parliament, because it's only the rump that Thomas Pride had left behind, which was very loyal to Oliver Cromwell and to the army. So, shortly after this, on the 27th of January 1649, Charles I is tried as Charles Stuart for treason and sentenced to death, a sentence that was carried out almost immediately on the 30th of January 1649 when the king was beheaded, which shocked lots of people. Most people in England probably did not expect their king to be executed, and it really upset a lot of people throughout Europe, other governments, especially that of Scotland, because Scotland was pretty enraged. They had actually been the ones who formally captured Charles initially and handed him over to the English, and the English never bothered to mention to Scotland that they were, going to execute the king. So that very much so upset the Scottish. So now Cromwell is going to go finish off those royalist supporters, those Roman Catholics in Ireland. So he goes over to Ireland and essentially finishes off any royalist armies in Ireland at the Battle of Drogheda on the 30th of August of 1649. But, meanwhile, Charles II was recognized as the legitimate sovereign in Scotland, and the Scottish go so far as to say that he's not only the legitimate king of Scotland, he's the legitimate king of England as well. And they publicly are claiming that they're going to put him back on the throne in England. So their forces, their armies are beginning to push into England, so Cromwell goes back to England and fights the Scottish for a few years. In 1650, Cromwell defeats the Scottish at the Battle of Dunbar and then at the Battle of Worcester. And at Worcester, I'm pretty sure Charles II was actually with the Scottish forces and may have been captured. I'm pretty sure he was captured by the English and eventually sent back to Scotland. So now Oliver Cromwell has emerged as the Lord Protector of England because he has defended Parliament from the Royalists time and again. He's defended them from the Irish and the Scottish, and he seems like the guy who's always there to defend Parliament. So they begin calling him the Lord Protector. And of course, as a result of Pride's purge, the Grandees, which really I think all look up to Oliver Cromwell as their leader, are really in control of Parliament. Now it's that rump Parliament that he controls. So on the 16th of December, 1653, Cromwell is formally named the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth for life. So now he's basically a dictator. He has more powers than any king of England has ever had before, and he controls the Parliament because he was able to purge it via Thomas Pride and has this rump. And it's kind of ironic because the English Civil War began because you had a king who didn't want to cooperate with the House of Commons. He very reluctantly called the House of Commons and very seldomly did so. Now you have Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector, and he did call Parliament from time to time, but always very reluctantly, and he didn't get along with his Parliament very often. So Cromwell and the Commonwealth become the status quo in England for 5 years, and then Cromwell dies in 1658. And Oliver Cromwell's son Richard takes over as Lord Protector, but he was never much of a Lord Protector. He was just a boy at the time. And he wasn't really very politically ambitious or astute, and the people of England, I think, were very much so tired of life after the king. They were tired of this puritanical way of life. So figures including Thomas Fairfax and Sir Edward Hyde and Duke George Monk go to Charles II, and they work out negotiations to bring him back as their sovereign king. And Charles II returns and is formally coronated as king on the 29th of May, 1660. And almost immediately he comes up with a new Act of Uniformity in 1662. If you think back to the beginning of the English Civil War, the old Act of Uniformity under Queen Elizabeth that had been the status quo, had set the basis for the Book of Common Prayer, was something that led to a lot of contention. So he came up with a new Book of Common Prayer, a new Act of Uniformity that worked for all people. And of course, the complaints of guys like Pym and other radicals that were more Calvinistic have certainly been told back. People aren't quite that pious anymore, that puritanical in England, now that they've actually had to live with that as the way of life. So they found a new status quo for the Church of England. The other immediate concern of bringing Charles II back is that this is a guy whose father was beheaded by this regime. This is a guy whose mother was almost killed by this regime. This is a guy who was almost killed multiple times by this regime and has spent his entire life hiding from the English. So they're worried that now, as King of England, Charles II is going to be a vengeful ruler, and he's going to go after lots of figures in Parliament and have them executed for treason, and is going to be very vengeful. So Charles II is willing to work out a deal, the Act of Indemnity. The Act of Indemnity basically apologized for executing Charles I, said it was a wrong thing to do, and in exchange, Charles II does not live up to that stereotypical vengeful king who has everyone executed for treason. He doesn't do that. But the Act of Indemnity did not pardon the 33 regicides that actually signed the death warrant of Charles I. So those individuals that were still alive fled England for the most part. Those that had already died, their bodies were supposedly dug up and desecrated. But that really was a relatively peaceful ending to that predicament. Charles II could have not cooperated and wanted more people to be executed for treason, and that would have really complicated things, I think, at this time. But for the most part, Charles II isn't seen as a vengeful ruler at all. In fact, his nickname is the Merry Monarch. He was seen as a bit of a playboy. He was a happy guy. He was the guy that brought Christmas and alcohol back, He's a good guy. And he put the Test Act out there also, because there's still all this concern of popery. So the Test Act was basically, when you became an MP in the House of Commons, you had to swear an oath denouncing transubstantiation, denouncing the Pope, basically to demonstrate that you are not a Roman Catholic. And that was able to appease all these concerns of popery, because of course his mother was Henrietta Maria, the whore of Babylon. Then there were a few conflicts, political scandals pertaining to popery throughout his lifetime. There was the popish plot of Titus Oates. Titus Oates was a guy who had studied with the Jesuits at one time in his life, and he claimed the Jesuits were trying to assassinate Charles II so that his brother, James II, who was a Catholic, would become king. And that was put out there for a while, and I think like 15 people ended up executed within the context of the popish plot. But by the time of Titus Oates' death, most people thought he was a liar, and most historians don't think very much of that plot today. But it was really promulgated by the Whigs in Parliament, although the Tories found it absurd, and eventually the Tories struck back with their Rye House plot. The Rye House plot basically said the popish plot was ridiculous, because if Charles II was ever killed by Jesuits and his Catholic brother James II took over, his Catholic brother would still be succeeded by his Protestant daughter Mary, because James II was married to Anne Hyde, the Protestant daughter of Edward Hyde, who had brought Charles II back as king. So in the Rye House plot, the Tories proposed that it was actually Protestants that were trying to kill Charles II as well as James II, so that Mary, this Protestant queen, could take over and you'd have a straight line of Protestants, hopefully forever. And neither of these plots, the Popish plot or the Rye House plot, is seen as being actually a plot. On hindsight, by historians, both seem very weak in terms of the evidence that either plot was a real threat. But they were both things that played very heavily into the politics during the life of Charles II. Until Charles II died unexpectedly in 1658, he died unexpectedly, and his brother James II, this Catholic king, is now king. He's now his successor, and it's not a big deal because he's got a Protestant heir himself. But the problem was his wife, Anne Hyde, died, and then he remarried a Catholic woman. And the Catholic woman got pregnant a few times, which scared Parliament very much, because if she had a Catholic son, then they have a Catholic line that they're stuck with after all of these struggles to get the papists out of England. Eventually, this woman does give birth to a Catholic son, and Parliament is very displeased. Now, before this Catholic son comes out, his Protestant daughter Mary was the heir to the throne, and Mary had gone off and married William, Duke of Orange. William, Duke of Orange, is the son of his father, William, Duke of Orange, same name. His father was William II, he's William III, and his mother was also named Mary. She was the daughter of Charles I, and then he, of course, turns around and marries Mary, the daughter of James II. So William, Duke of Orange, William III, married his first cousin, Mary. But both of them have enough Stuart blood in them to have claims on the throne. And of course, they're Protestants. So with the support of Parliament, after this Catholic son is born, William and Mary show up in southern England with a huge army and a huge fleet from the Netherlands. And it scares James II very much, and James II flees to France. Parliament, especially the Whigs in Parliament, are very happy about this, and they regard James II leaving England for France as abdication, and they coronate William and Mary as the dual monarchs of England. This is seen as the Glorious Revolution, because it is really a bloodless revolution. Soldiers were brought in, but no one ended up actually killing each other. The war was averted. Nevertheless, the Glorious Revolution really was anything but bloodless, because a few years later, in 1691, James II reemerges in Ireland with an international Catholic army that he raised both out of Catholics in Ireland and other parts of the British Isles, as well as Spain and Portugal and France and elsewhere in Europe. And when he shows up in Ireland, he has a claim on the throne of England, and obviously this is going to shake things up a bit. So William, the Protestant king, raises his own international army of Protestants. These are Protestants from England and elsewhere throughout the British Isles, as well as the Netherlands, where he was the Duke of Orange, and parts of Germany and Denmark, where there were lots of Protestants. So William's army clashes with James II's army at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland, and William is victorious at this battle. So it forces Charles II to consent to the Treaty of Limerick signed in June of 1691. This treaty denounces his claim to the throne completely, and now William and Mary are the indisputed dual monarchs of England and of Scotland. Mary rules until her death in 1694, and William rules until his own death in 1702, when their daughter Anne becomes queen. Anne is queen from 1702 until 1714. She is queen in 1707 when the Act of Union is signed, which means that she is the first queen, the first monarch of Britain that's actually the monarch of Great Britain and not the monarch of England or Scotland. I think all of the Stuart monarchs were technically king or queen of both England and Scotland, but they were king of them as separate entities because the Act of Union had not yet been passed. But from this point on, the king or queen of England is really the king or queen of Great Britain. And then, of course, Anne dies in 1714, and George I becomes king, and this is the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasty. So, I know that when I've reached the Hanoverian dynasty, I have gone way beyond the English Civil War, and we've moved on to a new chapter of history. Thank you to everyone who watched this presentation. I really, really, really appreciate your support, and I would really appreciate a comment or a like or a subscription below. Thank you. Have a good day and a good night as well.